Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this amazing roundtable. My name is Marga Weiss. I am on the board of CLAGS, and it is my pleasure to introduce the roundtable today. As you all might know, CLAGS was the very first university-based LGBTQ research center in the United States. And now we are reaching our 40th anniversary. 40 doesn't seem too old to me. We continue to maintain a broad program of public events, projects, and fellowships that nurture both cutting-edge scholarship and community building. At CLAGS, we believe in providing free public LGBT studies for everyone, for CUNY students, the many New York City communities, and folks near and far, as the panel today will demonstrate. This vision depends on friends like those gathered here today, and your help is especially welcome in this troubling time when queer and trans studies in higher education is explicitly threatened. So please, if you can, donate to our current campaign by using the link that we will be posting in the chat. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming you to an awesome panel on queer and trans world anthropologies. The roundtable today is part of a year-long CLAGS series on queer globalizations. And I want to start by thanking our co-sponsors, American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University, the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium, Feminist Studies, and the Orphalia Center for Global and International Studies at UC Santa Barbara, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Amherst. And those are the amazing sponsors for the whole year-long series. This series was originally inspired by the 25th year anniversary of a CLAGS conference, 1998, called Queer Globalizations, Local Homosexualities, Citizenship, Sexuality, and the Afterlife of Colonialism. And that conference, I thought, was just really ahead of its time in thinking about what queer globalization could mean, how we might pressure, shift, rethink queer studies in a more transnational or global angle. And so now, many years later, we're taking the opportunity to ask, to think with cutting edge scholars and activists, what is queer globalization now? How can we think queer and trans from elsewhere? We have had 4 previous roundtables last semester and this semester, and I'll post in the chat. Here is a link tree, so you can see the previous events from last semester and the one that was just last week. There are videos of those. And you can also register for the upcoming roundtable, the very last one in our series, which is coming up in April on queer and trans asylum and migration, which you definitely won't want to miss. But let's get to today's roundtable on queer and trans world anthropologies. We are joined today by scholars and activists from India, South Africa, the UK, and the US to think about queer and trans methodological, ethical, and epistemological interventions from the Global South. And I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator and the amazing CLAGS board member who put together this roundtable, Svati Shah, who is an associate professor in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Amherst, to introduce the panelists and get us started. So thank you to Svati and to everybody for being here today.
Thank you so much, Margot, for that very lovely introduction and context for today's conversation, along with the institutional sponsors that Margot thanked. I want to mention that the project that we are speaking from today, which is called Queer and Trans World Anthropologies, was also supported in part by the University of Massachusetts Amherst, the University of Bergen in Norway, and the Universities of Pretoria and the University of the Free State in South Africa. What I'm going to do is talk about the project that we're speaking from, which I will, as a shorthand mark, as QTWA, Queer and Trans World Anthropologies. I'll talk about what we've done so far and what we hope to do with this project. And then I want to give a little bit of context for the kind of theoretical, political, philosophical questions that such a project both generates and tries to address with respect to the series that we're very grateful to be part of, the Queer Globalization series that Margot has initiated. I also want to really give a big thank you to our ASL interpreters. It's such a gift to be able to have ASL interpretation for these events, and it's a commitment that CLAGS has made that I really admire and wish that all institutions could make such a commitment. So thank you very much. So Queer and Trans World Anthropologies is a project convened by myself and Paul Boyce, who will be speaking as part of our roundtable, who's at the University of Sussex. Just in terms of who is represented here today, we have members of the project joining us from Arizona, from the UK, from India, and from South Africa. And this really reflects the kind of dispersal that a project like this happily contends with. People are located in institutions all over the place, and Chicago. Sorry, Gayatri, I forgot Chicago. The project itself began as a way to try to address one of these foundational problems and problematics within both queer studies and anthropology, which is this kind of forever oppressive specter of the dominance of Western academia and global North questions that emerge from academies in the global North that everyone in the world has to somehow contend with. We face this problem in our citational practices. We face the problem in the way that we structure our questions. And what is always been kind of particularly interesting to me about this question is that there are deep roots for other kinds of questions in Anglophone, Francophone, Spanish-speaking academies all over the world. And yet we still seem to be contending with this idea of a hegemonic global North philosophical enterprise when we engage with for example, as we are with questions of sexuality, gender, and gender identity. So as an anthropologist who is also, for better or for worse, still committed to the discipline because people like myself believe that all the problems that the discipline generates also, the discipline also contains the tools and the personnel and the citations necessary to be able to counter some of those problems. I initially, I'll speak for myself, Paul can give his own version of his attachment to these questions, but I certainly felt that world anthropologies was one place, one kind of useful font of addressing some of these problematics. So I'll just read briefly from the abstract of the project that has sort of been circulating in various places. In this abstract, we defined the Queer and Trans World Anthropologies project as one that convenes scholars working in queer and transgender anthropology, in this case, mainly in Southern Africa and South Asia, although we're certainly hoping to expand beyond those two zones. Participants have collectively reflected on methodological, ethical, and epistemological innovations in queer and transgender anthropological work that is emerging from these regions. In so doing, the project addresses a lacuna that emerges at the intersections of queer anthropology and world anthropology. World anthropology asks what happens when people who used to be thought of as natives become the anthropologists themselves, while problematizing the discipline's relationship to geographic containment and alterity. At the same time, while there's been an efflorescence of queer and transgender research within numerous non-Western academic contexts, work that is marked as queer anthropology or queer studies often deploys Euro-American historical reference. Bringing world and queer anthropology together, the workshops and the network examines what new forms of critique and research priorities are being generated through ethnographic research on gender identity and queer sexuality in the Global South. The network does so by engaging with the history of anthropology's itinerant interests in sexuality and gender identity, and by identifying critical priorities, including juridicism, temporality, migration, language, racialization, decolonialism, casteism, affect, assemblage, and emergence that emanate from the worlds of queer and transgender anthropology in and outside of the Euro-American West. So one of the reference that I believe keeps coming up in the context of the Queer Globalization series is an article by Jasbirpur and Maya Mikdashi. The article is from 2016, I believe. Yeah, and it's called Queer Theory and Permanent War. And it's an article that I'm sure many people here are familiar with. And the article begins, can queer theory be recognizable as such when it emerges from elsewhere? And it goes on to critique the dominance of the US in queer studies and in writing on queer studies. And this is an article in GLQ. And I suppose I wanted to kind of end my introduction of our project and network with that prompt to say that a project such as this tries to invert some of those questions. So we might ask, what happens when we are generating this kind of work from places that, from a certain perspective, are defined elsewhere, but for us are here, and elsewhere is somewhere else. Part of this problematic is, of course, the tensions that we deal with in our own academic context. Within the context of a US academy, it becomes imminently necessary to constantly criticize American empire and American hegemony. I suppose our project takes a different perspective on that question, to ask what kinds of politics of knowledge production, circulation, and citation do we avail for ourselves when we are trying to center critical questions in the places that we're working. So I'm going to leave my introductory comments at that and open up the roundtable itself. I think what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce each speaker and their location. And then, of course, if you'd like to say more about yourself and the project that you're working on, please feel free. And we'll just go through our list and look forward to a Q&A afterward. So our first speaker is Niharika Banerjea, who is joining us from the Jindal Global Law School in New Delhi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to CLAGS and to Svati for and Paul for bringing us together. It is rather late here in India, so if my sentences are a bit too long, please bear with me. I'm Niharika Banerjea, and I teach at Jindal Global Law School in Sonipat, Haryana, which is outside of Delhi, but within the Delhi National Capital region. So it has a very interesting geographical location within erstwhile farmlands in the region. I identify as a queer academic activist, and also am I come from the oppressor Brahminical caste location. And the work that we are referring to here, I, along with my friend and colleague Dhiren, who's going to speak next. The work that we did as part of the QTWA project is a conversation about urgent witnessing during the COVID-19 induced pandemic. Dhiren, along with Dhiren, I and 6 other friends and acquaintances got together, not together as in all of us together, but Dhiren and I, separately with Grace, Shintu, Urmila, Devangana, Natasha, and Ree. And we talked about what they witnessed during the lockdown. And this witnessing was about the effects of lockdown around themselves, as well as, what kind of transactional networks, community building, etc., were they also involved in during the lockdown. And they had certain, some of them had phones, smartphones, messaging and video call capabilities, and very importantly, letters as well, as Natasha and Devangana in the middle, who, in the slide, they were incarcerated during that time. So all they had was access to letters. So all of this, all of them opened up alternative registers of social care and connections at different scales. And we need to remember that all of these people that you're seeing on the screen, representations of them, are within the midst of different kinds of colonialism. And the kind of colonialism that we are referring to in our geographical context is deeply seated in a kind of Brahminical carcerality, as scholar and lawyer Nikita Sonavane would say. Dhiren and I are the academics here who were and still are firm about not using our friends and acquaintances that you see on the screen as data for anthropological knowledge circulation. But rather, we are interested in thinking with them to produce knowledge about queerness, queer living, and what queer living meant during the COVID-19 induced lockdown. So here, I think we would like to remember the words of Abhay Flavian Khaka, an Adivasi scholar and anthropologist who died of a massive heart attack prematurely a few years back, who wrote, and I quote, "I am not your data, nor am I your vote bank. I am not your project or any exotic museum project. I am not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor am I the lab where your theories are tested." And these are the first few lines of the poem, and you may read the whole poem later. It's easily available on the internet. But this very crucially, speaks about methodological ethics, citational practices, and definitely, within transactional anthropological endeavors between the global South and North, but also crucially how that is reproduced in the context of the global South and specifically in India as well. So who are our anthropologists? What kind of caste background did they come from? Who was the other in this case? So I think there are different scales of hierarchy and that we are pointing to in our work as we spoke to Grace, Shintu, Urmila, Devangana, Natasha, and Ree. And in our work in the paper that we are finalizing for the QTWA and as part of this network, we recount tales of desire, resilience, loss, and activism with our 6 friends and acquaintances, as power had locked out and enclosed humans in petri dishes of seclusion, cutting off communication and livelihood across Kolkata, Shaorafuli, Delhi, and Thoothukudi, all places that are in different hierarchical geographical relationalities within the nation state. The methodology that we employed was urgent witnessing, a call to collaboratively rethink with the people whose lives, while determined by gender sexual norms, are not limited by them. And, we were very clear that for us, queer is not identitarian, even when identity matters, very crucially, but modes through which we reimagine our lives, centering our stories in conversation with different but interlinked precarious forms of living. In this endeavor, we were joined by Pratik Draik, who also, you see in the screen, a Dalit queer urban designer who did not offer us mere representations, but invitations to all of us and to the audience to engage with the generosity and compassion of our friends and acquaintances that you see on the screen. So these, friends and acquaintances are very much the authors of, of the knowledge about the effects and relationalities that were produced during the COVID-19 induced lockdown, just as we are today. Now, what brings the stories and lives together in our work is not a selection of interlocutors, but the fact that these persons are in our communities, most of whom we are in sustained relationships with. The question that, that we have been thinking about, that we address in our work, and which is a sustained question, that how might we think about doing anthropology, research, or queerness differently if we do not talk about selecting interviewees or sampling interlocutors, and we start instead with friendship. Perhaps it is time that friendship as a method is taken seriously in queer anthropological endeavors to cut through some of the, if not, totally be able to dismantle, but at least cut through some of the global north, global south hierarchies, both, in terms of its geographical scale, as well as, the presence of the global north in the global south, and the presence of the global south in the global north. So I think I will, end here for now, and we will go to the next speaker. I can come back to some questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niharika. What a fantastic opening salvo for our conversation. Our next speaker is Dhiren Borisa, who is also at the Jindal Global Law School in Sonipat.
Hi, thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever we are. The kind of dispersed geographies we are trying to capture together. I'm primarily a geographer, that's by training, but I'm a storyteller. I think the ways in which we can appreciate lives that we study or appreciate lives that we come across and want to engage with is through stories. And stories are powerful tools of world making. So when we engaged in this project of thinking about friendship as a method of queer liberatory praxis, and we were thinking about how can we do the similar thing in a decolonial way, but decolonizing not just in terms of Eurocentric coloniality, but thinking about the everydayness of coloniality that works in many of our lives. So people who live in South Asia, or South Asians which have occupied half the world now, including United States, coloniality of caste cannot be denied. And if caste is a currency through which sexuality is transacted, and we make our worlds, it also needs to inform the ways in which we do research. So when we engaged with Ree, Urmila, Shintu, Grace, Devangana, and Natasha, we wanted to bring these worlds together. We wanted to think about desires and aspirations and possibilities that we created in times like COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted to think about the queer world making that was possible from the peripheries, but also from the peripheries of the peripheries. And not just think about North and South as this easy dichotomy, but thinking about the South of the South, when you think about the politics of knowledge production that happens from our contexts. So let me tell you stories, and stories that can help us shape the worlds that we want to make. Niharika introduced that we worked this alongside Pratik Drake, and instead of thinking of the stories that we collected and ethnographic vignettes that we engaged with as data that we brought back and then dealt with differently to create material, we wanted to co-create knowledges. So all these maps that you see, all these designs that you see are produced together in collaborative ways with friends that we worked with, acquaintances we worked with. So on your screen is the story of Urmila. Urmila, a Dalit lesbian sanitation worker who challenges this lexicon that has traveled from the West to us. What does lesbian means? But what does lesbian mean to people for which the language itself seems alienating, but the ways in which we have brought meanings into those vocabulary? To think about what are the new worlds we make in terms of the everyday living reality when she works as a sanitation worker, but she has lost her job and now she's protesting for her fellow workers, but also trying to survive the hardships of the life. How does one understand queerness without understanding the nitty-gritties of all of these ways in which one has to define oneself and determine oneself? She tells us a story. Next to the university where I also studied, where she used to work long time back, and she stays nearby in a slum, a basti, where mostly lower caste people and working class people live, next to an affluent central government employees society where respectable people live. She tells that our walls are created for us. We want to think about queer world making through these walls. Walls between North and South, but walls between us and them, but walls that we readily break. She tells very honestly and very beautifully that in the night, when the affluent, respectable society build a wall to divide the basti and the respectable society so that the virus of COVID does not reach them, the young men of that neighborhood went and broke down the wall. And that's the lesson of knowledge production politics that I want to think about. What does that breaking down wall mean? And what does walls keeps on thrusting upon us think through? On the screen right now is another set of stories which are messy. And I want to think about these geographies as messy geographies, but ephemerally messy geographies, where we create these nooks and corners where possibilities can be imagined. On the screen are stories from prison. Jail number 6, which is women's prison of the Tihar jail in the state of Delhi, where 2 of my friends who were arrested were kept. And they shared stories from there. What kind of witnessing erupts from a place as dystopic as a prison, when you cannot even see the sun or the sky, or where? When you see a rainbow, the children are erupted with laughter. When an inmate comes to you to make you your scribe, to write a poetry that can survive them, even if they do not, because of the hardship of the prison. Or when a song is being played on the TV screen and everybody in every different barracks decides, let's play the same song and let's make it into a dance party in a prison. And I want to think about the joy of queerness that erupts in these possibilities that we create, even in these spaces, which are supposed to be dystopic and sad. My friends tell that when we played that song, a Hindi Bollywood old song, which is an item number, holding on to the bars, a trans woman on the other side of the prison just started dancing, thinking it was a pole. And to think about a letter, a poetry of love, or the isolation in the prison when everything seems will never happen tomorrow, you still dance. You still make things possible. And I want to think about that possibility in the queer world trans anthropologies, to think about the possibilities and how we capture that possibility without being violent towards it, without being extractive of what we imagine out of those things. So I want to take you to this slide. Brightly colored walls of Shintu, the Bahujan trans woman. against the pastel colors that gays and lesbians loved and love in their houses because they look chic. She lives in a sex workers neighborhood, and the beauty of the way in which she embodies the house is the motifs that you see on the wall, the flowers, the fairy, the butterfly, also adorn her body like tattoos on her body. She desires, like many of us, to live elsewhere. Elsewhere, which has been produced also in the same language, not as the periphery, but elsewhere where she cannot afford to, the respectable people stay. So she tries renting an accommodation in Green Park across the railway line, which determines and bounds where good people stay and where bad sex workers stay. She knows everybody is watching. Like we know when we walk on the streets or in academia, we produce or practice any of our research, we know we're continuously under surveillance, what we can do, what we cannot do, what we can write, what we can speak. She does not sleep in that house which she has rented. She does not know how long will she be able to pay the rent. She comes back to the sex workers' neighborhood in the night when the sun sets, knowing that's where the peace is. I want to think about queer world trans anthropologies as these geographies of comfort, but also geographies of aspirations that we carry in our bodies. And where would these aspirations lead us and the possibilities they can create? I'm thinking about this poetry by Dalit Tamil poet. She wrote originally this poem in Tamil, where she's talking about rural morphology in India, where all the Dalit households are the periphery of the village, outside, against, and away from all the resources, how they flow. Like the ways in which, when we tell our stories in academic spaces, we are told they're not cited enough. And we want to think, can't these stories be citations in themselves? Nobody before us talked about our lives and lived worlds in honesty. Can our stories be citations to each other rather than quoting people who never spoke about honesty or sit in academic departments where we cannot never reach? So Geeta Rani writes, and I repeat, and I want to think about a reversal of the colonial gaze here. She says, in their minds, I who smell faintly of meat. In their minds, I who smell faintly of meat, and in my house where bones hang bereft of any flesh, and on our streets where young boys wander without restraint, making loud music to coconut shells strung to their skin. In their minds, we are at the far end of the village. But I keep assuring them that we are at the forefront. This is where the village starts from. And that's where this queer world trans anthropologies project is leading us to think about what we call elsewhere, where is already defined as the one which is legitimized and respected and authenticated. The else or the otherwise is where knowledge is. It's where it's beginning. Let's reverse the map, because the map looks much beautiful, but the map is upside down. Thank you.
Wow, thank you both. There's too much to say already, so we're just going to carry on and come back to this already very, very rich discussion. Our next speaker is Caio Simões de Araújo, who is a fellow at the University of Western Cape and a research officer at the Other Foundation in South Africa. Caio.
All right. Thank you so much, Svati, for the invite. It's a pleasure to share this research in this new space. I like how previous speakers emphasize the role of history and memory. We are here in a way celebrating the longevity of our LGBTI Research Center, a research agenda. We are marking the anniversary of a very important LGBTI queer research conference. Dhiren also emphasized the role of geography. So my research has a lot to do with geography and history with location and memory. The working title right now is Remembering the Future. And because place is quite important, I like to start with a map. This is a map that I like to show. It's the latest map I could find online that actually pinpoints the distribution of lesbian and gay archives and libraries around the world. It's from the late 80s, so you can imagine that the landscape today would look quite different. But the reason why I show this map is so we can remember, but also because in a way, the overconcentration of institutions of queer memory in the global north remains a reality today. Of course, and my next point is, we are going through a contemporary boom on queer archives and museums and libraries in the global south. Here, there are a few examples. So we have now different archives in Argentina, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Pan-African archives that are all doing this work of documenting, remembering, and creating the conditions of possibility for a queer history. And the point of departure of my research is, first of all, what is that about? Why are people suddenly interested in archiving, documenting, and remembering in the Global South? Because again, if we look at the literature on queer history and archiving in the Global North, that is literature and a type of work that has been going on for quite some time. In this literature, the role of HIV/AIDS as a kind of trigger for the archival drive has been quite documented. So in a way, the labor of remember is intended to counter the sense of loss that is caused by death, in this case, the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the 80s and 90s. But there's something else going on with these initiatives in the Global South. And this is one of the questions that I am raising in my work. I wanted to showcase this particular initiative, which is a completely digital archive that intends to document trans and intersex history in Africa. It's an organization with which I work quite closely. And the reason why I'm raising this is that they have a completely voluntary archival practice, in the sense that it is up to trans and intersex organizations and individuals to actually submit their entries to be archived. And I think that says something quite interesting about the archival drive, and something perhaps particular about the Global South that we need to pay attention to: the desire to be archived, right? So this will come, I'll elaborate on that in a minute. So as you know, as Svati mentioned, I'm based in South Africa. I have been working for quite some time with this organization that you can see here in the slide. It's called the Gala Queer Archive. I put in here their website. And it is the oldest queer archive constituted in the African continent. It was formed right alongside South Africa's transition to democracy in the 90s. And just like the project I just mentioned, the way they started operating was also through donations of individuals and organizations that wanted to be part of what a queer history could look like. But then what happened, as with many other voluntary archival initiatives such as this, you end up with a collection that is biased in particular ways, because in the South African context, white, liberal, middle-class people are the ones that were the ones that had the conditions of possibility to create their own private collections and then donate those collections to be inscribed into history. So I think this raises important questions about the biases in queer archiving and the particular ways in which that plays out in the Global South. In the particular case of Gala, instead of just accepting donations, they also had to create strategies to go out into the world and grow their collections. As I mentioned, I have worked with them in a particular archival making projects, and especially to create archival collections in Angola and Mozambique, which are two contexts that from the outset are already marginalized in African narratives about queerness, in global narratives around queerness, because they are doubly marginalized by virtue of being placed in Africa and then by virtue of being Lusophone countries. So, in a way, excluded from particularly English-speaking networks and circuits. So I have worked with Gala in a project that started in Mozambique and then it later expanded to Angola. But it was a project to engage activists, engage organizations. In this particular case, we were collaborating with Lambda, which was the first LGBTI organization created in Mozambique in the 2000s. And the project was about archiving what activism and what queer lived experiences were about. A lot of it was creating archives for organizations themselves, compiling things like newsletters and educational materials that organizations had produced throughout the years. We also went far back into the colonial archives to find traces of queerness. For instance, these are clips from colonial era newspapers from Mozambique from the 60s, in which on the right, there's a very lengthy interview with a drag performer from Mozambique in the 1960s. So those were quite interesting because neither I, as a researcher, or the communities we were working with had any idea that this was going on in this country in the 1960s. We created a photo book as well in Mozambique, where photography was used as an archival method. And this was because we've noticed the inbuilt limitations of oral history as an archival methodology, in the sense that oral history presupposes an interlocutor's ability to narrate themselves through words, the ability to communicate through narration, through language, through spoken speech is a particular ability that not everyone shares. So we thought that using photography could include a more comprehensive aspect, especially for people who did not necessarily have the practice of self-narration, which in many ways is a condition of possibility for their inclusion in the archive, their ability to tell their story, right? And So these are some pictures of the book with LGBTI people in Maputo. We also created a podcast because we really had this idea of an archival project as something that is not really about recovering a history only. It is about intervening in the present and the future. So, and this leads me to the extension of the project to Mozambique. One of the episodes of the podcast was an interview with Pamina Sebastião, who is a LBQ activist from Angola. And Pamina had been the creator of the Angolan Identity Archive, which was the first archival organization created in Angola. So in Angola, we ran a project called Identity Queer, which was basically a reimagination of how people would like to be seen by the state. So the question that prompted the work was asking people, if you could choose to have your ID photo taken in any way you want, how would you like your ID photo to look like? And then the photos were reflective of that. As you are aware, identity photos have all sorts of restrictions. People have to look a certain way. They cannot be holding certain objects. And this was an exercising, if you could be seen without any restrictions, how would you be like to see? And also thinking that identity documents is like, it's a basic archival document, the ways in which these documents end up kind of inscribed in history. So in a way, all this work and this paper and this research is almost like an autoethnography about my own position as someone that has been working on this project in terms of building these archives and building these collections and working with these communities. And now it's almost a process of looking back and asking, what does that mean from the point of view of queer theory, and particularly queer archival theory that has been a brand of queer theory that, in my view, has been overly dominated by the global north. Most of the publications and works of reference, they have to do with queer archives and collections in the global north, with very few exceptions. And through this work, I'm trying to figure out what is particular about queer archiving in the global south, without forgetting that perhaps one of the main differences, and I'll just, before I conclude, go into one of the questions that we were that we were asked to think about today, has to do with an extremely uneven funding landscape when it turns to do the work of queer memory, right? Organizations such as the EU, for instance, they fund queer archives in European countries because it's part of creating an European heritage. No country in Africa has the same privilege of receiving the amounts of funding that these memory institutions in the global north are receiving, or have received in the recent past. Although I'm very curious to think about also what's going on in the US at the moment, in which there is a very clear movement towards erasure and not memory. So I think we have a very interesting context and perhaps a shift in terms of the conversation to think about. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These papers already have so much synergy. It's almost like someone should make a network of people thinking and writing like this. Moving on, our next wonderful speaker is Gayatri Reddy from University of Illinois in Chicago.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, those were amazing presentations. So, well, first, thank you to Swati and Paul and others who helped organize the conferences in the UK, South Africa, to all my interlocutors there for their generous engagement and feedback, and obviously to the staff at CLAGS for convening and managing this gathering, and to Margot and others for conceptualizing the series and including us as a part of it, and to all of you for being here in the middle of a busy Monday, in the middle of a completely ridiculous month that we're all grappling with here in the US. So I haven't had a chance to attend or listen to all of the panels that went before us in this series, but that's a really nice treat that I can look forward to. So as Swati said, I'm Gayatri Reddy. I'm an anthropologist by training, I guess, who mostly sort of hangs out in the Gender and Women's Studies and Globalizations Studies programs at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So my project kind of comes at this a little bit differently. And it's prompted by, I suppose, a couple of different things. One was the realization that this year, that's 2025, it will be 30 years since I began the research for what eventually became my first book with respect to sex about hijras in Hyderabad that was published almost 20 years ago. And I guess I'm dating myself here. So when Swati reached out last year and asked me if I wanted to reflect on and kind of write something from my vantage point, I figured it was an opportunity to reflect on Hijra studies as a field formation, kind of warts and all, and I agreed enthusiastically to participate in this. So the second sort of prompt, I guess, is that it engages to some extent with the provocation that Swati and Paul presented in the form of a deceptively simple question. And here I'm rephrasing a little bit. How do we think about the mutually imbricated logics of geography and queerness through a different lens or a different lineage? Right? And this is, of course, in part what Maya Miktashi, Jasbir Kaur, Anjali Arundekar, Geeta Patel, Howard Chang, Ani Datta, certainly Niharika and Dhiren and Caio and all of my interlocutors here and others are asking too. So in my paper, the paper that I presented in South Africa as part of this QTWA collective network, I argue that one potential entry point, and I want to underline the one potential entry point into this question, could be through a formation that I'm loosely calling critical Hijra studies, which in some ways is perhaps a subfield of queer South Asian anthropology and history that has arguably congealed in the last couple of decades. And I'm not by any means saying that this is a new intellectual formation. I'm suggesting it as a heuristic and sort of highlighting what has been produced in academia, and I'm talking about Hijra studies, under the sign of engagements with and about Hijras in the last 2 decades, and what it kind of allows us to grapple, or how it allows us to grapple with this question productively. So the piece I wrote for the conference last year was making a case for what I think this body of academic scholarship that I'm calling critical Hijra studies potentially allows us to visibilize, perhaps invisibilize, underline, and reflect on as we think through these vexed questions of geopolitics and transness, queer theory and its exemplars, anthropology and its demons, and how we can engage with them politically. And this question, as Caio just alluded to, is sort of more urgent, and Svati and Dhiren and Niharika is perhaps more urgent than ever today. Just before I sort of summarize what I argued in the paper, I guess there are multiple caveats that I need to provide when talking about something like critical Hijra studies. But in the interest of time, I'll just mention two. And here I'm indebted to my two graduate students, Shilpa Menon and Temal Elawala, for helping me think these through. So one is that this is a Hijra epistemology, and by no means the only one, and I cannot underline that enough. And two is that, as I said earlier, while it might be implicit, it's important to underline that when I talk about this potential Hijra epistemology, it is framed through trans and Hijra studies that remains mostly about Hijras rather than by them, with a few rare exceptions. So of course, that raises larger questions about the potential tensions between Hijra studies as an epistemic formation and Hijra's lived subjectivity and political demands, but I'll bracket that for now. So briefly, what I was trying to articulate in the paper that I wrote last year were a couple of interventions that I think the scholarship about Hijras brings to anthropology and to queer and trans studies, and to kind of thinking more generatively in this regard. The first one, and I guess I'll just mention three. I talked about 10 points in that paper, but I'll just summarize three or distill them down to three. So first one is kind of engaging or perhaps intervening in the debate about quote unquote proper objects or subjects of study in queer and trans studies by embracing with messiness and ambivalence that I think Niharika and Dhiren also emphasized in their presentation, and Margot and Martin Mannelanson have written about recently as well. So part of what I was arguing is that recent work in Hijra studies has consistently refused a singular narrative, whether this is in terms of refusing an analysis of gender and sexuality as the sole reference for understanding Hijra life and social difference, or refusing embodiment and body modification as the sole or necessary grounds for Hijra identification, or recognizing that state and NGO labels have always been shifting, right? So in other words, the current Hijra project, instantiated in what I'm calling critical Hijra studies, was never an airtight, singular, identitarian or anti-identitarian project. It was and remains open-ended, messy, contradictory, and shifting. And it's in engaging with this messiness that Hijra studies provides, I would argue, a generative opening for potentially theorizing transness and queerness differently. The second point is sort of being able to trouble easy dichotomies of scale and geography, as the two presentations have talked about already, and sort of grapple with questions of the global versus the local, elsewhere versus here, et cetera, right? The speakers in the only other panel that I engaged with in this series, in this Queer Globalization series, was the last one. And the speakers in that panel spoke very eloquently and effectively to this question and the false dichotomies or the vexed relations implicit in these framings. So I don't want to belabor this point too much. I think I can't remember how Kwame put it. I think he ended with the elsewhere is here, if I'm not mistaken. And Ani Datta's book is an excellent example that shows the overlaps, crossings, hierarchies, relations between so-called global and local. So here I'll just say that recent work on Hijras has pointed to the ways that Hijras have been defined through the quote unquote global long before the 80s and 90s, when globalization became a thing in academia. And here, for example, through colonial governance in 19th century British imperial projects, as Jessica Hinchey's work outlines. And at the same time, I want to kind of point to the fact that there's a certain capaciousness in recent Hijra scholarship that allows for productive re-engagements with the quote-unquote local, such as the recognition of the sub-region as an intentional site of engagement. And here I'm thinking of the work by Shilpa Menon in Kerala, or of trans-regional similarities across a wide swath of different geopolitical spaces, or of engaging with local difference without subsuming it under a singular category or mode of interrogation, as work by Adnan Hussain, Claire Pamet, Jeff Roy, and others have shown. And finally, obviously, to the questions that the series poses, but also to the our collective and network, as well as sort of thinking through what it means to decolonize or provincialize trans studies, tired as these tropes are, and thinking about sort of concrete ways to do this, from reorienting citational practices, as Niharika and Dhiren were pointing to, and Caio as well as people in the last panel in the series, to coining and highlighting processes of vernacularization, as Ani points to, calling out the unmarked geopolitics of interventions from the global north, as previous speakers in the previous panel reminded us of. And critical Hijra studies, I argue, also allows us to reorient genealogies of knowledge production, not only taking seriously the articulations of those outside Euro-America. So here I'm thinking of Shivdat Sharma's piece in recent piece in 2023, exploring what, as he says, Hijra epistemologies might have to say about trans categories, movements, politics, rather than the other way around, but also to critically examining the assumptions that sustain queer and trans knowledge production from the global north, such as the conditions of liberal modernity that structure queer and trans life in the global north and the global south, that need to be addressed and critiqued. And here I'm thinking of Temal Elawala's work in Sri Lanka as well. So in other words, I guess in my paper for the conference, I try and make a case for critical Hijra studies as a academic but potential heuristic that allows for a productive interrogation of the structurations, the meanings, the routings of queerness and transness, quote unquote, elsewhere and here, even as that very dichotomy needs to be troubled, as Niharika and Dhiren were pointing to. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. Our next speaker is Sara Suhail from Arizona State University.
Thank you so much, Svati. Thank you so much, CLAGS, Margot, Niharika, Dhiren, Caio, Gayatri. I have learned so much today from all of your presentations, and some of them, like the lyrical way in which you all were talking, I was like, wow, it's just beautiful. And and of course, thank you to our ASL interpreters, most importantly. Thank you so much. So I wanted to, I guess I could have talked about the paper that I talked about in the presentation, but I think I want to talk a bit more broadly about what got me to the research, because that, I guess, addresses more methodological concerns. And so I want to start with a young queer person. As a young queer person in Lahore, which is how I situate myself, as a young queer activist. So I was like, okay, so where are the lesbians at? What is happening? How does, the politics of being queer or gay or lesbian or trans or hijra or hajasira happen in this context? And so let me tell you a bit about Pakistan then, or specifically Punjab or Lahore, where I was situated. So I grew up in what I would argue is a military authoritarian context, which had periodic romance with fascism. Yeah. And so I want to center that because this is what defines my political universe as a colonial or post-colonial subject in Lahore, and now as a somewhat disoriented immigrant in the US facing fascism yet again, from Islamic fascism to Christian fascism. The faces look different. The end result, quite the same for queer, trans people across the board. So, as Pakistan, the military authoritarianism, the facade of democracy, and the colonial state apparatus with a love affair of religious nationalism. Under those conditions, the life of queer and trans people is disappeared. So we are the specter that haunt heteropatriarchy, religious nationalism, and authoritarianism. We haunt them every day. We haunt them here. As I was walking to my class, and I faced these large banners that said, homosexuality is a sin. Or as I walked down the roads in Lahore, with similar kind of baiting of whether I'm a boy or a girl. So, I mean, the similarity, the future of the US as Pakistan is something that I think about that in my research. I think about that in my teaching every day. So as a young person who's trying to be queer or whatever, gay or lesbian or whatever the terms and how they circulated to me, and I want to situate, as the speakers before me, caste and class privilege, which are the defining features of class, caste, religious, and ethnic privilege as defining features of my life in Pakistan. But even within those, specific privileges, how queerness just pulls the rug from underneath you, and then how to find alliances to survive, because the fundamental question then becomes survival, and how Khwaja Sira folks are actually, the only visible representation of queerness that has not been fully ironed out from society. And which is why my work looks at, the struggle for Khwaja Sira rights in Pakistan, or in another way, it looks at womanness as loss, how patriarchy, Islamic, nationalist, ethnic patriarchy sutures loss to the idea of womanness, and how then when that womanness attaches itself to people not conventionally thought of or sexed as female, what happens? Anyways, so what I realized, I guess, and the methodological question for me were methodological questions that have already been raised. I don't want to, the subject, object, the Western gaze, these categories that don't quite fill our language, our vocabulary, our vernacular, our vernacular language. So then who are we? Where do I see myself? Where do I see myself reflected in older, in older histories, in ways of being, or what future can I project, as a young Pakistani, as a young Lahori, even categories like Pakistani or South Asian, or, Punjabi don't fit either. So, I mean, we are fighting with so many categories and so many ideas of this sort of neoliberal modernity, and its worst excesses. It's literally its worst excesses, and then to reflect those excesses sitting within the metropole. I try now not to research Pakistan as much, I guess, because my location has changed. And this is my disorientation. I used to think that I live in Pakistan, but I come to the US on break. Now it has shifted, and now I live in the US and I go to Pakistan on break. And to then actually and actively in our work to break those cycles, the cycles of citation, the cycles of Pakistan always being the data, the space, as I forget, I think Niharika pointed out that poem which said it all, like, we are not your subjects, we're not your data. But then how to create poetry together as comrades, how to work together. And so one of the things I realized, I guess, through my research was that for queer folks in the movement who are trying to, bring about recognition, the categories of woman, or the category of the ethnic categories of Punjabi, the category of a worker, the category of other categories become really important. Because what happens in movements, in social movements, is that we get siloed, like we get in the academia. We get siloed in our little disciplines. But like, is queerness or transness or hijra, critical hijra, or Khwaja Sira something that people talk about in the labor movement, or is something that people talk about in the women's movement in Pakistan? And that intersection is really hard to achieve. And the only way I felt that it is achievable is if queer folks become more prominent in all the other movement spaces. And that is actually the intersection from which I come to the work, not as an academic, mostly as an activist, and more specifically as a political activist who saw the deprivation caused by neoliberalism, the rise of NGOs, and the loss of a political project. So the relationship of NGOs with our community is that, well, you're going to get foreign funding, and then the community gets something. We're not going to like when you see sort of Trump sort of pulling down, privatization, marketization, and deregulation, that sort of structural adjustment, we've been through that a million times. And sort of the balm for that has always been aid or foreign funding. And I've been teaching about this, and I mean, we could say we're really straying away, but actually, with the Khwaja Sira community and the queer and trans movement in Pakistan, one of the main things that keeps coming up is the shifting of funder imperatives. So one day it's, we're going to fund queer, let's say queer archives. The next day they're like, well, we don't think we can, fund queer and trans stuff anymore. We are now looking at climate change, or climate change isn't important. We're going to look at something else. So in many ways, I guess what I'm trying to say is that to understand queer theory, or even using the term queer, and I mean, in our little group, I was part of a political formation, actually a number of political formation. One of the queer formation was a queer feminist formation. And one of the first things we grappled with was this idea of Western discourse, stuff that Joseph Massad and all these people are writing about how, we pick up these terms. But like, Dhiren was saying, we put our own meaning to it, And part of the quest that we did actually was to look at like our own languages in Punjabi, in Urdu, in Sindhi, in Saraiki. We're like, what do we call ourselves? Like, how do we decolonize? But I mean, of course, decolonization can't happen just at the level of language. It has to happen structurally. It has to happen economically. It has to happen, coming outside of structural adjustment, outside of the international financial institutions, outside of, and is it possible to reconceptualize through queer, trans, hijra, and Khwaja Sira studies, not just language, not just our, citational practice, but how does it look outside of a decolonized third world political movement? And I guess that's my question. Like, how will queer, trans, hijra, Khwaja Sira studies save us from, the impending doom of fascism, of war, of genocide, of Palestine, of Congo, of Sudan, of the Baloch, of so many spaces within our national geographies, and then very intimately within our families. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zara. Right after this, I'm teaching Wilhelm Reich and Jaidas Banerjea. So you're like, we're right there, thinking together. By way of introducing our last but certainly not least speaker, Paul Boyce, I wanted to explain to the audience that everyone has referenced the conference, the workshop, the meetings that we had last summer. So everyone who has spoken today was part of a series of 2 meetings. We had one meeting at the University of Sussex, organized by Paul Boyce, who is in the anthropology department at the University of Sussex, and then another meeting in South Africa where we were trying to convene everyone around queer and trans world anthropologies to present and workshop papers, some of which have been presented today. I am very, very grateful to have kind of have a meeting of the minds with Paul in this project. Everyone should be so lucky as to collaborate with someone like Paul. Queer and Trans World Anthropologies is now our shared brain baby. Paul was very effective in getting resources so that we could have part of our meeting in Sussex, because there was a critical mass of people in the UK, and then we had the second part of that meeting at in the Future Africa campus at the University of Pretoria. And I'm grateful to both institutions for supporting our efforts to come together. And I hope other institutions follow suit in the future, even as we are facing some very dark times. So the last word goes to Paul, who, as I said, is an anthropologist at the University of Sussex.
Thanks, Svati. It's really, really kind of you to say what you said, and it's been a real joy to collaborate with you and everyone here, old friends, new friends among us. It's been nice to connect and reconnect in new ways, to explore commonalities that we already knew that we had, but to bring them alive in the context of different conversations. And I think these are conversations that we've been wanting to have probably for many years, and to create this kind of space and focus and intentionality has been really enlivening, and it's done a lot. If I can just speak for myself, it's done a lot for me. The collaboration with Svati and all of you has been really enriching. Sometimes we all face challenges in doing this kind of work, right? We all face kind of the constant feeling of erasure, sometimes more pointedly as in the present, but we've always faced erasure all the time in our departmental context, in the disciplinary context of anthropology, which offers potentialities, but also offers walls and boundaries to overcome. So I think it's been really important to think with you all. I was going to say, I just sort of have mixed ideas about what I'm actually going to do in the present moment. I was going to say something about the paper that I'm preparing for one of the publications that we are doing, but in the context of listening to you all, I've been scribbling notes, sort of sometimes alongside the paper and sort of within the paper as well. So I think what I'm going to do is going to read a little bit from the paper, and then in places I sort of pause and reflect and find resonances with things that you've all said today, and I point some of those things out, which means I might not actually complete the presentation as I was going to do it, because obviously it's become a different thing in the moment, but I just want to sort of capture that moment anyway. So in the paper that I wanted to explore the project of queer and trans world anthropologies by engaging questions that come to bear when these analytical devices and domain terms are brought together, queer, trans, world anthropologies. What happens when we bring those terms and the contexts and the thought processes that they affect into conversation with one another? I'm particularly interested in problems of relatedness and perspective and knowledge making in response to some of the questions that we set, as these surface when anthropologies of queer and trans experiencing are connected by research and others across global scales of action and analysis. In the case of the present project, I can conjecture that this may be especially salient amidst dialogues that in part circumvent some of the more normative and established transfer zones of queer anthropology, and we've noted the Euro-American dominance in those zonings. But more so, probably, like as we've mentioned a number of times today, and as we've all been doing, actually we also need to rethink the logics and the ontologies of that kind of perspective, as those very kind of geopolitical zones that we're we're worried about their hegemony, but also they are increasingly under attack, and pointedly under attack at the moment, right? You mentioned how CLAGS itself is facing very particular issues in the very present moment. So there's a kind of interesting challenge that we need to think about in terms of how we query hegemony, but also query how the hegemonic is also under threat from different kinds of right-wing kind of political action. We find ourselves on the front lines again of the politics of trade tariffs, extractive values of war, the rescinding of climate accords, all mixed up in those kind of geopolitical shifts. And we find ourselves once again in the fragilities of our positionalities, in the battles that we had kind of won around rights to gender self-determination, the global support of international development and associated equities, etc. And finding again that actually these constructs were always quite fragile. And amidst two, we face again the recognition that in most global contexts, these battles have anyway never really been won anyway, and queer and trans and otherwise gendered and sexualities non-normative persons have always been on the front line. I think it's really important, as Sarah has just said, you know, facing those same forms of fascism in Pakistan and realizing that fascism has many faces and similar intentionalities, and how we work with that in terms of our comparative projects and collaborations. And I'm drawing here on perspectives over time. And I was struck by Gayatri mentioning beginning working 30 years ago in India, and I'm remembering also working 30 years ago as a youngish kind of community worker who began working in an NGO in Calcutta at that time in the context of kind of HIV prevention work, community-based HIV prevention work, for which new flows of international funding were coming forth in a different kind of geopolitical environment, which, I don't know, allowed some kind of funding flows to happen, even in the context of other kinds of barriers and obfuscations. And that was a very analog moment as well. I think it's really important to remember that that was, you know, there's a sort of pre-internet moment. And I ended up working in a community-based project on sexual health promotion, what was then called MSM in India, off the back of having worked in London in a community-based project for sex workers. And the idea of sharing knowledge then was that you go somewhere to share it, because that was actually, that was the most effective way of sharing knowledge at that time globally. So it's kind of interesting to think how the global politics of knowledge sharing and transmission have changed over that period of time. And it was in the context of going there to share knowledge from one context in another that I ended up staying in India for quite a number of years. So amidst this, I've been wondering about the temporality of my own perspective over time, as the time frame of one's own life becomes part of memory work, one's own memory work and memory work with others. And it was also important for me to think back to that time, you know, 30 years ago, and to remember that my work then was taking place outside of any ambitions to become, you know, kind of an academic researcher per se. I was doing a master's degree in community work, and I had no intention of doing any kind of academic intervention beyond that. And I think this is a really useful thing, and I think it's kind of useful to think how we think about knowledge creation and interlocution. What does it mean to reflect on what perhaps over time became or seeded a form of ethnographic knowledge making, but did not have that intentionality sort of embedded into it in its own formation? How do we let go of being or conceiving oneself as the knowledge producer, as the knowledge maker, and all the kind of problems that it affects for how we relate to and work with other people? And I think for me, it was kind of useful to have had that formative experience, which, although I can't completely say that it didn't lead to an academic way of working, certainly didn't start off with that sort of intentionality as a grounding point of view. And I think then there's this enduring nature of relationships with a context. So it's interesting for me to think that actually still those relationships that were forged in the mid-90s in Calcutta have become some of the most vital relationships in my life, which is not to romanticize or disavow various crisscrossing intersectional differences and boundaries and privileges and precarities, class, ethnicities, and so on. But nonetheless, to note the archiving of one's own relational experience as a shared form of being, not necessarily as a device for knowledge making, but for oneself, having become a person in the world through those connections and all their varied manifestations, as a individual entity with the life world that one was living in and which one continues to live in. And I've been wondering this in terms of Caio and thinking of archival drive, if the generational aspects of that and how people of my generation are in a way finding themselves re-articulating their times and their memories and sort of trying to trouble one's own forgetting as a kind of archival processing of one's own becoming and being in the world and trying to track stories through that process. And I'm thinking of that as a device for ethnographic knowledge making, and how the archive of ethnography, as it accrues over time, becomes something that we revisit again and again and again, and which appears as something new and different and problematic. I'm thinking of people like Mary Douglas and Marilyn Strathern in terms of that kind of process. So against this background, one aim of our wider project here in the Queer and Trans World Anthropologies is to reimagine how research and knowledge from diverse global settings both cohere into new connections, as they can also in turn accent the assembled nature of queer and trans life worlds and subjectivities, friendships, anthropological knowledge making together, and so on. An effect is to productively query who and what we mean when we evoke queer and trans standpoints, epistemologies, and the persons and subjects and interlocutors who we evoke in our research and practice. And we've all, in one way or another, mentioned and troubled these kinds of relationships. So by taking up these concerns in our network, we mean to dislocate any sort of prefigurative assumptions that queer and trans anthropologies might be readily contextualized or grounded in the life worlds of entities who might be identified or identifiable in wholly cogent senses, as if we're looking for queer, trans people who are sort of out there in the world awaiting our empirical attention. And this is not to simply shrug off such requirements where, for instance, queer and trans anthropologies may be employed to political ends, to aid in the representation of marginalized peoples, to counter erasure and so on, and to provoke claims for legal recognition. As noted, this is imperative, and we have to kind of constantly rethink this project as we move through it and wonder about it. But under conditions of social political erasure and skewed recognition, we've begun to wonder what it might mean to stress the potency of queer and trans persons as anyway already in the process of constantly becoming and unbecoming, of not being in the world in terms of normally imagined personhood, singular, identifiable, distinctly embodied and documented in orthodox ways. This is not only querying the politics of identity, but querying the grounds of being in the world in relation to the worldliness of being. You know, how do we be as queer and trans folk in the world? How do we relate to identities or classification when we already know that in our experience, those things are always already incommensurate? We live within that experience. And the task, I think, of a queer and trans world anthropology is to dwell in that space and to hover between the imperative to make knowledge, but also the imperative to unmake it and allow for the unmaking of queer and trans experience in our ethnographic processes. And I'm drawing on Halberstam here, of course, in the imperative to attend to the absences and erasures within which we make and unmake our life projects. So as noted, actually, we know a lot about erasure, and we're concerned about erasure, especially in the present moment, but we've also, as queer and trans folk, found lots of space and potentiality within the context of erasure, within the context of hovering between worlds of being in the world and not being in the world, creating these kind of magical spaces that we inhabit, create with and think with, which is again not to romanticize erasure and to recognize that it is important that we counteract the pernicious effects of that, but it's also ethnographically to think with the potentiality of those kind of spatialities and how they challenge the idea of what we mean by ethnographic research. I think there's been a lot of stuff in anthropology recently about critical of ethnography and presenting a version of ethnography as just the description of life worlds, and then from which we then theorize and think. But I think, again, what's been evoked today so vividly and importantly is actually it is the living in the life world that is the philosophical activity. Living is a philosophical activity. It's where we think and feel. Affects are philosophical. We know that we hover between worlds. We know that we can sometimes navigate ways of being in the world where we sort of attain visibility and invisibility at the same time. We know that we can shift around in our genderings and self-presentations. We know that we can be many things at once. And I think this is an important way of querying what we're doing when we're doing ethnography and when we're producing anthropological knowledge. That what is it that we're trying to grasp? I found an old note in a notebook recently from some of those early days in Calcutta. It was probably written about 25, 30 years ago. And I tell myself, I speak of myself as a ghost moving through the city, as a spectre. And I was again struck by Sarah's evocation of spectral presence. And I think, you know, there's a kind of tension there. And also I'm not from Calcutta. I'm navigating this positionality of somehow not really wanting to, but somehow becoming an ethnographic researcher, navigating my own belongingness and not belongingness in the context of which I'm in, which somehow feels a bit sort of like being and not being at the same time. But I'm also wondering within that drag, whatever our positionality is, if when we're doing ethnographic research, are we trying to tune into these spectralities, if I can say that word, of being in the world, which don't necessarily boil down to the empirical, but which are nonetheless part of just practical being in the world. These things are not necessarily purely dichotomous ways of being, but they're profoundly interconnected. I think it's by doing and living in the world that we also generate and experience that which is other to the world. And I think there's something for us to tune into in terms of a project of queer and trans world anthropologies in terms of that kind of thinking. Okay, I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I know the audience is full of people who are also having synergy with our project. I've been getting lots of lovely messages, first, second, and third hand. If you are feeling synergy with the project, please reach out to myself or Paul. We know that there is a lot of need for something like this, and this is a very capacious set of questions that we're posing. Thank you to everyone who presented today. I think this was such an incredibly rich discussion. We have some time for Q&A, and I'm actually going to take the prerogative of the moderator to invite Francisco Fernandez. Fran, are you here? Hello, yes, you're here from University of Buenos Aires. I would love to give you the first, the floor to respond to any and all of what's said, and please introduce yourself in more detail.
Yeah, thank you, Svati. I'm here with Pato Laterra. We both are a doctoral fellow and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Buenos Aires with funding by CONICET, which is our national research agency. And I wanted to appreciate what this conversation, how this event allows for South-South conversations that aren't always possible. For example, I was particularly stricken by a vignette by Dhiren Borisa on a lesbian sanitation worker who had been fired and then continued to protest with her fellow coworkers, because it resonates so much with the research Pato and I are doing from trans studies on trans workers who work in the public sector here in Argentina in government jobs, who are being fired under the current ultra-right, ultra-conservative president. And Pato is also an activist within an organization of trans public sector workers who are working to reinstate themselves and their co-workers. So if it hadn't been for this event, for example, we wouldn't have found out about these resonances, very similar experiences, maybe not exactly the same identities, but the same connections between trans, queer activism and labor activism around work. Some of what we're working on will be published in a few days in the NACLA report on the Americas. I can throw in a link in the comments, although it's not published yet. And these conversations are of interest in South-South conversations, but I think they are also increasingly, unfortunately, sorry, for South-North conversations. And I'm saying South-North, not North-South, on purpose, because, for example, the reason that all of these trans public sector workers are being fired is that Milei, our current president, has this policy of the chainsaw, like taking the chainsaw to the government, cutting off all welfare policies, all government workers, as many as he can. And we have seen recently images of how he gave that chainsaw to Elon Musk, who very happily is taking that to the US as well. So I think these conversations are very important, not only in the sense that you said that world anthropologies show how people who used to be studied can themselves be the studiers, the researchers, but also ways that in the Global South we can, besides being case studies, we can also maybe be examples for the Global North, but not examples as case studies, but examples as in ways of being in solidarity and saying that, well, okay, maybe like Pato always says, the Global South is Chile, Argentina have often been laboratories for certain economic policies that are then spread elsewhere, like neoliberalism a few decades ago, and now whatever you would call what's going on now. So thank you again. This was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Fran and Pato. I really appreciate your presence here and your comment. And I will just say for everyone, Fran and Pato are economists. I know we've been having a very disciplinary set of concerns with respect to ethnography and ethnographic objects and friendship as method. I do think that some of the so-called disciplinary preoccupations we have are actually relevant for any number of other kinds of contexts. And I think particularly this question of how we make our research objects and that whole notion of the object and why it makes a lot of us uncomfortable as we're trying to think about the state, about the rise of fascism, and about the relationship between sexuality, gender identity, and the economy. So I invite anyone else to ask a question or make a comment, particularly if you're not approaching this as an anthropologist. I'd love to hear what a historian has to say, for example. But really, the floor is open if anyone would like to respond. Or if any of our speakers would like to respond to anything that's been raised. If not, I will just end by again saying how moved I am actually by the foregoing presentations. And yes, this sort of question of friendship as method that keeps coming up for all of us. I was just going to kind of mark that as a kind of unifying theme. And in fact, there are so many, but friendship as method, solidarity, I think those things really kind of run very counter to this kind of idea of the classical idea, if I can call it that, of the ethnographic method of being somebody from elsewhere who studies people who are elsewhere. We are kind of working oppositionally to that because of the politics around what we're doing. And at the same time, it's raising a lot of other interesting questions about materialism, about governance, about the distance between the law and everyday life. If no one would like to comment on any of this, yes, Paul, please.
Just to echo that point about friendship, because I think that's become so vital, in the network that we're creating, and also in the knowledge practices that we are reflecting on. And yet I still can't, although I emphasize friendship quite a lot in my discussion, I don't know that I've entirely resolved ever the problem of friendship as method, because it's still somehow there's this process of turning things into knowledge, you know what I mean? And how do we bring that along in a spirit of a friendship? I'm not saying that we have to resolve that, but I think that's a really interesting part of the conversation that we're having, and that we are working within certain kind of disciplinary critiques that our friends may or may not be part of, but they would be part of other kind of philosophical ways of being that we may or may not be part of. And how do we bring about those conversations together, I think is a very interesting project, you know what I mean? Again, I think that's what I was thinking about in terms of ethnography, not as description, but as philosophy. And maybe friendship is a form of philosophy, you know. I was thinking of the work of Zoe Todd, who describes working with fish philosophers in their work in Canada, and how we relate to fish, not as objects, but as co-philosophers in our work. So again, I think it's kind of also can extend this thinking to post-human perspectivism, to think about friendship and co-theorizing with other entities and other ways of being, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a lovely note to end on. I will make a small plug for the publications that are coming out of this so far. One is a special issue of GLQ. Another is a special issue of American Anthropologists. We certainly hope that there will be other opportunities to interact with a wider audience around this network. There will be a couple of more events, hopefully hosted by CLAGS and other entities in the future. And we very much look forward to meeting other fellow travelers in this endeavor. Thank you so much, everyone. Everyone clap for yourselves and each other. Thank you again to our wonderful ASL interpreters. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the future. Thank you for coming today.